Hey everybody, and welcome to a Kit Planes Roundtable. We're trying this in the era of COVID-19 to have a little discussion among our editors and contributors. Today's topic, we want to talk about build spaces and build techniques for your own shop. I mean, do you have to have a big shop? Can you make it with a little shop? And if you do have a little shop, how can you make the most of the space? So we're going to go around the room here. We have Paul Dye with us, who is our editor at large. Multi-aircraft builder and owner of one of the nicest shops I've seen. So welcome, Paul. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We have Mark Schrimmer, who's our executive editor, also an RV builder in this case, who I don't know if you specialize by intention, Mark, by having working in small spaces, but we'll come back to you with that. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
All right. Omar Filipovic, who is also a builder, a glass door builder, my neighbor at the airport, who has moved his project a few times and has a few thoughts on build spaces. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you.
And finally, Myron Nelson, who actually flies big birds for a living and is also a builder and is enjoying, I don't know if you're enjoying semi-retirement now or not. I don't think you're flying a ton, but at least it gives you time to work on your projects. Thanks for joining us, Myron.
Thank you.
One of the things questions we get at Kit Planes, and I know EAA gets this as well, and you hear it at the EAA chapters, is what kind of workspace do you really need to build an airplane? I think we tend to see these garage mahals in magazines and on websites and say, you know, it's really nice to have a huge space to build your airplane. That's not necessarily true. A lot of us have started in one-car garage or in basements and been able to at least get a really good head start on a project. And ultimately see it to completion. So as we talk today, bear in mind that there's lots of ways to skin a cat and many, many different ways to set up your workspace. I hope to give you some guidance here on things that have worked for us. Pick and choose from that. Some things may not work for every builder and every situation, but I'm hoping you'll get some value out of the entirety of this. And I'll remind you here at the end as well, but hit us up with comments here at the bottom of the video. We'd love to know what has worked for you. And we're also hoping to continue this program. So give us some ideas on the topics you'd like to see us talk about. We love to talk and we love to talk to you. So give us something that interests you. So with that, I'm going to move over to Mark Schrimmer. Now, Mark, I know you've been building in a relatively limited space. And that requires a few adjustments. Tell me a little bit about your project.
I'm building an RV-12 in one half of a two-car garage, pretty normal sized garage. And one of the requirements of building this project was that my wife's car has to remain in the garage all the time. So that gets me down to about half the garage. And then I kind of put a requirement on myself. I wanted to be able to build a pretty big part of the project and be able to keep the car in the garage. The idea was to make the car last a little longer so I could spend more money on airplane parts and less money on cars. So I came up with kind of an unusual workbench. It's about 90 inches wide. 90 inches long and 24 inches wide and 44 inches high, which is enough for it to go over the hood of my car when the car is in the garage. And then when I'm working, I back the car into the driveway or space permitting on the street. And there's actually two of these workbenches that are 90 by 24. And when I need a big surface, I have the two workbenches next to each other. And then for a lot of projects, it's actually more convenient to just use half of the workbench, the 90 by 24 segment. You can move around the project. So if you're working on something like an aileron or a control surface, it's much more convenient than the full width of the bench. And then there's also been a lot of times when I've moved the benches, so I'll have one in one part of the garage and one in another. Sometimes they're next to each other with about 3 feet of space between, and I'm in the middle and I'm working on one project on one side and some other parts on the other. And I found that that's worked pretty good for me. I'm making reasonably steady progress and would probably do it again if I did another project. I'd do it the same way.
Well, that sounds like there's a little bit of a game of Tetris going on there as you move parts around to extract the car. Obviously, do you find that? I mean, obviously, it's got to slow you down just a little bit because there's some setup and breakdown time. How do you compensate for that, or what's your strategy for saying, "Listen, I'm going to have a mess here for a little while. How do I get an unbroken amount of time to work on that?"
I have to admit, it is a pain sometimes because you're absolutely right. You have to break down the workspace to put the car back in, and I do lose a fair amount of time doing that. If I'm doing something that's going to take a couple of days, like when I was riveting the tail cone of the fuselage, I leave the car out and I leave the workspace set up, and it's probably been left up for as long as a week at a time without the car going back in and out. On a typical weekend, though, I'll pull it out maybe on Saturday and then pull it back in on Sunday, and that lets me work on it whenever I want.
Thanks for that, Mark. Paul Dye, I'm going to come to you next. I know you had the opportunity in your relocation to Nevada to create a little bit of a dream shop, a little bit of a blank canvas. Walk me through kind of your thought process on how you put your shop together.
Yeah, I like most people started building airplanes in my garage, and I found that if you've got kind of a single bay and you've got workbenches and tools around the outside, that can be fairly efficient. I then moved to an air park where I had a hangar, a 50 by 50 hangar, and I discovered that was actually far less ideal of a build space because, again, you've got all of your tools and workbenches around the outside. You've got airplanes in the middle, and so you'd end up having to wander around airplanes to get from one workstation to another. And invariably, your bench grinders on one side and your toolbox is on another, and so you're just going back and wandering around, and it doesn't get very efficient. When we moved to the new place, we first built the hangar and had the same situation. I kind of tried to set up the workshop in the back of the hangar, and that was better, but it's still mixed up with airplanes. So we eventually added on an actual workshop and tried to optimize it. So we've got various areas to do various things. I've got one workbench which is really dedicated for electronics, avionics, fine work, where if you've got these little itty bitty screws, you're not going to lose them. Then I've got an area where we do metalworking with the heavy machines, the band saws and drills and mill and lathe. And then a large workbench which you can work around all edges of the workbench so that it maximizes that use. And then we've got one dedicated bay for the airplane that you're working on when it gets big enough that it's a big thing. So that's kind of the evolution of the workshop, and I guess the emphasis, the takeaway there is that while a lot of people dream of working in their hangar, a hangar is really not a very good place to work if there are other airplanes in it.
Yeah, that's a totally fair point. I can sympathize. I shared a large box hangar in California with a good friend of mine, and when I was I wasn't building at the time, I was maintaining the Sportsman, but it was one of those situations where I was probably flying more than he was. So the airplane was at the front of the hangar, but all my tools had to kind of go to the back. And I ended up building these, roll around cabinets and things like that as a way to keep from having to put on, 20 miles every time I worked on the airplane going from the front to the back.
Yeah, and one of the things to remember is that building an airplane, whether it's metal, composites, fabric and tube, whatever, there's a mess component. There's the dust component. If it's fiberglass dust, you sand it off. If it's a metal, it's aluminum dust everywhere. My optometrist is always can't figure out why I wear out glasses so quickly. They get scratched. It's because there's aluminum dust flying all over. That gets in everything. And so if you can try and make your messy part in one side of the building and your less messy part in another, that'll help.
Absolutely right. Now, Myron, I know you and I talked about offline. You had some similar strategies in terms of defining your tool sets and getting them in a mobile way so that you can actually bring them to the airplane. Why don't you walk me through what you've done?
Well, I'm not Paul Dye's neighborhood, literally or figuratively, but I am kind of in the middle. I was able to build a dedicated building on our property, knowing when we built it and designed it that I would build an airplane there. But we also built it for other, for actually a land-based RV storage later on, and even during. And so we were able to put in things that a normal garage would not have, like running water, hot water, and 220. And I put a swamp cooler in and a lot of other accoutrements, knowing ahead of time what I would be doing. The actual shop part, I put a garage door on both ends of the shop so I could open it up and completely flow through. I live on a corner. One side went to the street and the other went to my backyard. And fortunately, in the summertime, real close to the swimming pool where I would jump in when I just had enough. So I was getting what chips Paul was getting on his glasses, I was getting my pool filter. But at any rate, I did all the construction. It's probably the size of a garage and a half in square footage, although I had a land-based RV in there that I would slide all the finished components underneath there where they stayed nice and out of the way. I could actually mount the wings on the airplane inside to do the fairings and things, although I couldn't get it out of that building with the wings on. So took the wings back off, put it on a flatbed truck, took it a mile away to the paint shop, and then did the final assembly at a municipal hangar at Falcon Field that I had on a waiting list. So I had both the experience of doing it in the shop right at the house and the final assembly at the hangar, and they're a little bit different. So additionally, I've recently built a hangar at an air park, which is a whole nother deal, which I'm planning around building again. So each one of those three areas have their advantages and their disadvantages. So I'm trying to meld the advantages of the first two into the third. So that's a work in progress, and we'll see how that goes.
Well, that sounds, I'm envious of having the swimming pool right next to the building. I think that would be that would be a little too tempting. It's like, well, yeah. I'll finish riveting after the sun goes down. That's great. I'm going to come on back over to you, Omar. I know that you have moved your Glass Star project a number of times now, and you've got it in a T hangar where you've put together some nice touches in terms of organization. Why don't you walk me through a little bit about that? And I'm really kind of curious to know something we haven't really touched on here yet, but this decision, do you build at home or do you build it at an off-site thing in terms of your time allocation?
Right. It started in a 2-car garage, and it's a Glass Star, which has one wing is 16 feet long. So it can be built in a single car garage to a point. Then you run out of space. You have to mount the wings on the fuselage at some point to rig everything. And if you don't have any space in your backyard to do it, then you're stuck. The benefit of having it at home in an attached garage, it's always there. So if you have 30 minutes of time, you can just pop in the garage and do some work on it. Now in the hangar, I have all the space I need, but the hangar is, 25, 30 minutes away. So if I have 30 minutes to work on it, I'm not going to make it. It's just not going to happen. So I end up in front of the TV like Mark did. But the hangar allows me to have all the workbenches that I want and all the shelving that I need, and I can put the parts away, and I have both wings in their own jigs at the same time. So it's really handy. And when I get going, I really can make much better progress than if I have to shuffle things around in a Tetris-like fashion. I've set up some movable carts that help me have all the tools at hand when I'm working. So if I have the wing on my left side and I can put some tools on the bench below it, I also roll up a cart with other things that I need that are accessible to my right hand. So I don't have to make any steps and everything is right there. I have extra surfaces. So that saves a lot of time. And I don't have to, if I'm tired at the end of the day, I don't have to put anything away. I just turn off the lights and go home. And then in the morning I can come back and carry on where I left off.
So really, it's you know, it ends up being a bit of a compromise. I think for me, you know, I've done it both ways. The nice thing is, as we've obviously seen building at home, is you're right there. If you have 30 minutes or 45 minutes, you can apply that to it. But it's also really easy. You're 30 minutes into a 45-minute job, and then somebody says dinner is ready. Okay, then you got to drop it and go. And it does sort of, it splits you a little bit. And it's very easy to look around and go, God, I got to mow the lawn, or I need to fix the washer, or whatever it is. Whereas at the hangar or your shop, it does tend to sort of regulate you a little bit in terms of, this is what you're here for. You're going to work on this, and you know the lawn can wait until I get home. So, you know, there's a different philosophy I think you need to apply regardless of where you're working. But the most important thing is that you have the space that's comfortable enough for you to work in, and compelling enough to go out and do that, whether it's at home or in a hangar. So I appreciate those points of view. I'm going to roll around the room. Now we talk sort of big picture stuff. I'm kind of curious to how you guys deal with sort of workshop organization at the smaller level. I mean, how you manage your toolbox or parts organizations and things like that. Mark, you have probably the biggest challenge in terms of space. So how do you apportion you know, square footage in your shop for tool storage and things like that?
That is indeed a big challenge. I have a couple of toolboxes that I'm able to move around the shop, and so that's good because the space is small. The tools are always nearby. The downside is I tend to take a lot of tools out, and before I know it, I'm surrounded with a big mess. And so what I tend to do is after a couple of hours, if the work area gets too messy, I stop and I put everything back in the toolbox. In contrast to the shop that's a mess, my toolboxes are actually organized quite well. And so if something is in the box, I can find it almost immediately. But once it's out on the floor or on the workbench, it could be anywhere. And then the other challenge you face is as you start to build structures for the plane, some of them are quite large. So I've built some racks in the garage. For example, for the tail cone, I built like a really light duty workbench that goes over a workbench that I no longer use except for the drawers. And then this workbench also goes over my compressor and the refrigerator in the garage. And then the tail cone sits on top of it. And then above that, I have a rack that was originally made to hold a kayak, but it's perfect for empennage parts. There's a little curved strap, and it'll fit the airfoil on the stabilator perfectly. And then, like many other builders, I also have various parts stashed around the house. Most of my empennage is actually behind me right now in my office. And someday, when I move the project to the airport, that'll go with it. I figure I can probably build this thing until I get to the point where it's on the gear and the engine is mounted, and then it'll be time to go to the airport. But for me, the airport is like an hour away, and that's with LA traffic being good. So I figured it would probably be better to try this one at home.
That's great, Mark. Thanks. That yeah, LA traffic. That's there's no fun in that. Myron, what do you have for us in terms of just organizational things that you found really useful over the years?
One of the first things that I bought, and I would definitely buy it again if I was building another project, which I intend to do. I went to the aviation rack at Harbor Freight, and I bought their, it's called 74 bin double-sided floor rack. And it's a rack on wheels. It's got a tray at the bottom. It's got 3 different sizes of little parts bins. And when I very first started inventorying my very first kit, the smallest bins are nice sized to put. I labeled each bin for a particular rivet size, and then moved on to the things that you use in high volume. I would just put like the same nuts that you use a million times, same washers. put them all in their individual bin. And it stayed that way through the entire project. And it's the same way today, even though you organize a little bit different as a maintainer than you do as a builder. It's still been extremely helpful. Another thing I was able to do was buy a strip of the same stuff that those bins hang on and put it along the wall at the back of my rivet table. And so I would grab, if I would look at the plans and it showed, 3 different sizes of rivets for that particular project to finish, I would grab the bins for those 3 purposes, hang them right there at the rivet table, do the project, and then go put them back on the rack. Or I could just, the rack's on wheels, I could wheel it right up next to me. And so I have one of those little tool tote things that I had all my rivet gun and the bucking bars and all that type of thing at the bottom of it. And it was one of my most cherished possessions. And they're selling it right now, I see, for $129, which is a steal. And you can find in the magazines, you can find a coupon for 20% off. And so extremely helpful in just organizing everything. The larger bins, in Vans kits, they have all the little brown paper sacks. And I would just put those, one of the bin sizes is perfect for those. They all just stack in there like a library card file, and you just put them in numerical order. And so when the parts list says to go find this one, it was very easy to do and very easy to inventory when you got a new kit.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And one of the things that gets me is the time required to go find something. I'm always trying to get things organized to the point where if I need a particular screw or if I'm working on some electrical stuff, that I have pretty much everything I'm likely to need for that project more or less in one space, or at least organized in such a way that I'm not bouncing back and forth even, the corner of the back of the hangar. I have the workbench sort of set up at the tail end of the T hanger that I'm in now, but anything to cut that time down, because ultimately that ends up being a little bit frustrating. So whether it's a roll around thing
Exactly.
or other organization, I mean, it all really helps with that. Now, Paul, I think we talked about in another topic, how many tools you have of a certain type, and I don't know how many 3/8 wrenches you have, but I probably have 30. No, it's probably an exaggeration, but it's probably at least 15 somewhere around.
Yeah.
What are your views on that?
Yeah, there's 2 alternatives to having the right tool at the right time. One is to make sure that you're totally organized all the time, and the other is just to have a whole bunch of the same kind of tool. So especially when you have, if you're building, for instance, if you're building an RV or a Sonex, you only need 2 sizes of wrenches, a 3/8 and a 7/16 for about 95% of everything you do. So you want to have about 10 or 15 of those in sockets and open ends and combination wrenches, and just have them around the shop so that there's always one close at hand. If you're building a metal airplane, you can never have too many pairs of Cleco pliers. At least half a dozen spread around, so that you're not having to go find my Cleco pliers. You just grab with the one that's closest at the time. I like to have multiple air hoses available, especially when the airplane starts to get big, so that you don't find that the hose is always on the other side of the airplane. You want to have one on either side of the airplane, so they're easy to get to. When it comes right down to it, I don't like to spend other people's money, so to speak, but sockets and wrenches are pretty cheap if you're just doing general purpose stuff. So have enough of those. The other thing I like is lots and lots of bins, just like Myron was talking about. I have a whole bunch of these little pull-out drawer bins that, again, come from Harbor Freight or Home Depot or wherever, mounted to the wall with all of my hardware. And every time we have a major show, AirVenture or Sun and Fun, I go up and stock up on standard sizes of AN3s, AN4s, lots and lots of washers, lots and lots of fiber lock nuts. I rarely use what comes in the kit, because it's easier to go get what's out of my stock. And it's really nice to have that fresh hardware when you need it. So organize your tools by having lots of them. Organize your parts by having good storage for them.
And that's really important too. Not only is the storage, well identified, so you know what's there, but you know, secure enough so that you don't pull out the drawer and have it drop all over the place. I've had.
Oh yeah, there's nothing worse than having a whole bunch of different sizes of rivets in a little compartmented box and it drops on the floor. People say, how do I sort that out? And I say, you don't, you just throw it away and start over.
So Omar, something you and I have kind of experienced too, and it actually relates back to what Paul is saying. When you're dealing with hardware kits like the Glass Star kits, and this was true actually when I did the 2 Weeks of Taxi program, comes in these plastic bins, segmented bins. And those are fine for if you have, you know, all of your number 10 countersunk stainless steel screws are all in one place. Now you've got 15 different sizes in one place. But I'm actually in the transition from that to a system more like Paul's, where everything is in one and I can grab the specific one that I'm looking for. Now, Omar, I think you've seen some examples of sort of a hybrid version of that. You want to describe it?
Yeah, one of the first things I did when I got my kit was take the rivets and the most common hardware out of those bins, which are, I think, 4x6 compartmentalized plastic, see-through or semi-transparent, and put them in there, put each size of hardware in its own designated bin that I can take out and bring that one bin with me where I need it. So the Glass Star kit had project-based or task-based bins. So if I'm working on the rudder, they would put 3 Allen bolts and 25 rivets and a spring or a bearing in one of those. But it's really hard to reach in there and grab a little rivet from a hole that's, you know, 2 inches by 1.5 inches. So I took everything out of those and organized it in the Harbor Freight pullout bins. So I think every builder has a good relationship with Harbor Freight. My roll-around cart is also from Harbor Freight, and that's one of the things that I touch most often at the hangar, because as I move around, I put the things I need at that moment in the cart and bring it with me. It follows me around.
That's great. Yeah, I think once and again, you really need to build your shop in a way that makes logical sense to you. But you know, and again, anything that increases the accuracy, you're reaching for an AN3-7 bolt and be able to get it the first time rather than think, oh, is that a 6 or a 7, and take it to the part and otherwise you got the wrong one. Anything that can improve that accuracy and sort of save you a little time and frustration is definitely worth doing on the front side of the build. Now, currently, I'm in the situation where I'm doing more maintaining and modifying than building. And so one of the things I've done, and I think it's probably still useful as Omar is doing, is build a sort of a roll around thing. So I have a large tool chest at the back of the hangar where all the heavy stuff is, stuff that you use occasionally. And I basically decided to put everything there to begin with. And then as I worked on the airplane, I would bring out tools one at a time that I needed. And those that ended up on that roll-around bench eventually found a home in the drawers of that bench, to the point where now, for the most common things I'm likely to do on the airplane, the tools are already there. And I make an effort to roll it out of the back of the hangar and roll it up to an area close to where I'm working. It's a fine line. You don't want it underfoot, but you also don't want to walk out to the wingtip every time you need a tool. So, you know, everybody's going to find a different sort of sense of space and comfort when you do that. But you know, anything you can do to make that organization better, to speed the time it takes to get to the tool you need, really helps. So I think these have been all really good suggestions. Let's go around the room one more time. If there's anything you guys have thought of as we're talking that you want to share with our readers, let's do it. Let's start with you, Myron.
You know, a thought that just hit me when you guys were talking about that about the different sizes of things. I started this project with almost no mechanical experience whatsoever. I built a few balsa wood airplanes, and that was it. Tinkered, you know, I could change a battery on a car, but nothing really heavy. And one of the things that a mechanic friend told me to do when I started, when you first start with that low level of experience that I had, every rivet looks the same, every bolt looks the same, every thread pattern looks the same. I mean, I knew the difference between Phillips and slotted head, but that was, you know, but what's amazing is I challenged myself from the beginning, every time I'd grab something, to try and identify it and learn it. And it's amazing, 7.5 years later, if you do that, you know, you can look, because I had always admired mechanics that could look at a nut and say, well, I need a 3/8 wrench, just because they knew what that was, which to a neophyte, you don't know. But if you challenge and you test yourself, and of course I would always confirm anything, you know, that was primary, but I loved that I could look at a nut on an engine or any place else and go right and get the right tool and not have to grab 3 to go and see which one actually fit. And so that was just a mental exercise that someone taught me very, very early on, that really helped and is proved very invaluable as a maintainer after you know, because the project's never really done. We all know that. But at any rate, just a little trick of the trade.
That's good stuff. I don't know about the rest of you guys, but I grew up with Japanese motorcycles. So the transition from the metric system to fractional was really tough. And then you throw all the AN numbers. It's like, oh, that's an AN 365 dash blah, blah, blah. What? It's what this wrench fits on it. That ought to do it. So yeah, I mean, I think the point is that the more you work with this stuff, the more you're familiar you are with it. You know, Omar and I were working recently on doing some riveting on his glass door wing, and you know, we started off, since I hadn't done riveting for a while, and you know, checking every tail with the thing and just making sure everything was right. And like by the end of the second day, where you're going, yeah, it looks good, looks good, looks good. It's repetition, and it's becoming familiar with this stuff enough that you're confident and you know what you're looking at. The tools are always there to verify. But I think for beginning builders, it's really important to understand, as Myron pointed out, that you do get really familiar with the stuff at some point, and you know, your confidence grows with that. Is it possible to still make mistakes? You bet. We all do it. We've had those experiences where we've had to drill out a few rivets, and that's just how it goes. That's part of the learning experience. So thanks for that, Myron. Omar, what do you have to add to it?
I think the shop space should be comfortable and inviting, to put it bluntly. You want to be there. If it's cold and dark and you know, mice are running around, you're not going to make much progress. So we'll make it a second home, and customize it to how long your arms are, you know, how many steps you need to take, and make it work for you.
That's a really good idea. I think one of the best things I did was throw a microwave and a little pony refrigerator into the hangar, so that you're never thinking, oh, I got to break away and go grab some lunch. You always have a little bit of something there. So that's a good recommendation. Mark, what would you like to add to the last little bit here?
Something that I've found has really come in handy is having these portable tables that you can buy at Costco or Home Depot or wherever. They're very lightweight, but they're sturdy enough that you can put parts on them. And I have a couple of them. And when you start running out of space to put various assemblies and stuff, having a couple of tables around to set everything on is almost as good as having another workbench. And the other thing I would say is, if you're going to build your workbench yourself, make sure that you leave a lip on it. You will find yourself constantly using C-clamps or other types of clamps to hold things. And if you make the table edge flush with the support structure underneath, that's not going to work. So make sure it extends a couple of inches over the frame of your workbench.
That's a great suggestion, and I'm taking it to heart, because I inherited this huge metal table that was left in my hangar when I moved in. And I skinned it with wood, and I made the mistake of having the front edge of the wood flush with the front edge of the metal underpinning. And almost the very next thing I did was I wanted to clamp down. I have a magnifying light with a little fluorescent bulb in it for working on those high density connectors. And I went, oh, I don't believe I just did that. I had nowhere to clamp it. So that's a really good piece of advice. Mr. Dye, what else do you have for us that's interesting?
Just a couple things. One thing to mention on workbenches, since you guys are talking about them, absolutely you want a lip, and also make sure you've got a sacrificial top to it. You are going to, if you're building a metal airplane, there's nothing quicker than to drill right into it, to Cleco parts to it. So if you build a beautiful Formica top, buy a piece of 3/4 inch thick OSB to put on top of it so you can drill into it. Then when you unpack your kit and you've got this huge pieces of cardboard boxes, take one of those big sheets of cardboard, put that on top of the sacrificial top so you don't scratch things. So make sure you realize that workbenches are not to be looked at, they're to be drilled into, right? And you can always, when it gets really bad, you can just replace that piece of sacrificial material. Something I don't think we've talked about is good lighting. Really important to have good lighting in your shop. LED lighting now is so inexpensive. Have a combination of lots of lights on the ceiling and then lights that you can move around to get the lights in the direction you need it when you need it. And lastly, Omar mentioned make it a home, make it a comfortable place. Almost everybody has had to remodel a house, remodel a living room, and you've got to figure out what to do with that extra recliner that you no longer need. Put it in your shop. It's great to have when you decide you need to sit down and do some research on through the Aircraft Spruce catalog or whatever, and you just might end up falling asleep in it. It's great.
That's a really good point, and I will add to that as sort of a final point here. Is one of the things, you know, I work in a T hanger that has a concrete floor. Putting some sort of foam pad or a rubber pad or something down on the floor so you're not standing on cold concrete, especially here in Oregon, where it can be a little bit, you know, damp and not particularly pleasant to work in the hangar in the wintertime. Anything to warm it up a little bit and to give you some comfort as you work. Not only makes you want to go there, but it takes care of some of the fatigue issue. And I think we really do tend to make more mistakes building and flying when we're a little bit fatigued. So anything you can do to make it a more comfortable space where you can work a little bit longer, you can work more efficiently, is really going to pay off in the end. And I think, you know, ultimately we do these things because they're big, important projects. They're really cool to do. They do take stamina. They take you know, a fair amount of fortitude to get through. But you know, we've all done it, and it's one of those things that you're really super happy to do at the end. So I'm going to switch back to gallery view here. We're all on screen. Thank you guys for dropping in. I know we all have lots of stuff to do. Appreciate your time helping us out with this. And for our readers, again, hit us up with questions in the comments. There'll be links below to the stories and kit planes and other stories we have to support these ideas. We really do want to hear from you, and let us know what works for you. And whatever you do, keep building. Thanks for dropping in.
Thanks.